I'd like to welcome you to the CITP webinar series. I'm Alan Winters, co-director of the CITP, and also actually one of the academics involved in the work that we're talking about this afternoon. That work is to give you some preliminary results about citizens' juries exercise that we've conducted along with NatCen on public attitudes towards trade policy issues and how they reach those decisions. You didn't come here to hear me talk. I'm going to move straight on, and I'll introduce our speakers as we go through. So first off, I'm going to ask Kieran Cummings to make a presentation about the process of the citizens' juries itself. We're very grateful to NatCen for having organised all of this for us, and Kieran is the man. So Kieran, over to you.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks so much, everyone. So I'm just going to share some slides. Okay. 1 moment. Is that showing up okay for everyone?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic. So yes, thank you again, Alan. As Alan said, my name is Kieran Cummings. I am a senior researcher at the Centre for Deliberative Research at NatCen. NatCen is the National Centre for Social Research. We are a social research charity, and we work with a range of different organisations, and we paired with the CITP on this to support them to use deliberative methods to understand how the public think about complex trade policy decisions. But before I get into all of that, what is deliberative research? So deliberative research, as you can see from the kind of phases on the screen here, is about providing research participants with the time, the information, and the right discursive conditions to really engage in depth with a topic. And this typically takes place over extended periods, so it might be a few hours, right up to full-day workshops, and it might run across multiple workshops, as it did in this research. The material on hand, as I say, is around a given topic, so in this case, of course, trade policy, and it's provided to ensure participants have access to the same sort of balanced information to inform their views. So informing participants' views is really central to what deliberations and deliberative research is all about. And to ensure those discursive conditions, we have well-trained facilitators on hand to support participants to debate and discuss this information to ultimately form their views on complex policy. And so
I think we've lost Kieran, the joys of modern technology. The idea was that Kieran told you how we did it. Dan and Maria are going to talk about what we actually found. So this is the first of those substantive presentations by Daniel Wincott, who is the Professor of Law and Politics in the University of Cardiff. And over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much, Alan. Can you hear me?
We can.
Right. So my task is to introduce the substantive results of the Citizen Jury Project, which was focused on trade-offs and UK trade policy. And it has a number of components. There was a pre-survey and post-survey to check to what extent, if at all, participating in this deliberative exercise changed people's views about trade policy. A series of 4 substantive online citizens' jury events, and then a final event in person that synthesized the trade-offs and brought together the work across the whole area. So I'm going to talk about the survey work a bit and the first couple of substantive trade-offs, and then hand on to a colleague who'll talk about the next couple of seminars. So Underpinning this research, we had a couple of key issues. We're interested in trade policy choices that the UK makes. So what are those choices substantively? But we're also interested in how the choices should be made, including who should be involved in making them. And the focus of this work was very much on providing a deliberative context in which members of the public could work through the choices, the trade-offs, the balancing out of different elements that is the stuff of trade policy. So as I've said, there's an initial concern with overall trade priorities. And then the first couple of workshops, one was on trade and human rights, and the second was on balancing the trade policy impacts across sectors of the economy and regions. So if you look at the big questions about the priorities for trade policy, we saw that in the pre-survey and post-survey, so the pink column and the yellow columns in this chart, we saw that overall, our participants saw generating economic growth as the main objective or main purpose of trade policy. And that didn't change very much pre and post survey, pre and post the deliberation. There was some emphasis on other priorities like combating climate change and supporting human rights and labor standards. But in terms of the overall question, the priority was very clearly on economic growth. But when we turn to more specific questions about the relationship between trade agreements and their impacts on the economy, but also on other areas like impact on employment rates, we found that drilling down, there was much more concern about the potential impacts of trade policy on employment. So protecting the rights of UK employees seemed important. We found similar results on employees in trade partner countries. We also saw considerable support for combating climate change, even if it means less trade overall in these pre and post surveys. So there's a bit of a dilemma or a paradox here between the overall objectives of trade policy and then the specific concerns that people articulated. And that's an issue that I think we want to drill down into more in looking at this work in more detail and perhaps in further research. NatCen produced this word cloud that gave a sense of what the priorities of participants were overall in trade policy. And you can see a mix of benefiting the UK population, but also local and regional needs, human rights, standards, and the environment. There were four main priorities that came through, and I know these will be picked up in the next presentation. So priorities around fairness, around the UK's national interests, around regional and local interests, and also a concern with long-term impacts of trade policy more than short-term impacts. So now, turning to the first substantive event, which was on trade deals and workers' rights. We saw considerable support for protecting higher worker standards in the overall scenario, especially when it was presented initially, arguing that the UK should accept aspects of a trade deal that require higher workers' rights in India if India is to have access to UK UK markets through a trade deal. When we changed that scenario a bit to say that the economic impact on India would be negative as a consequence of these restrictions, people shifted their view somewhat. So we can see an impact of deliberation in this scenario. as I'm sure Kieran would have explained, the scenarios, the work was conducted across 5 specific locations, one each in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, and a couple in England. And we see fairly consistent patterns across the different places in relation to the original scenario and the altered scenario. So we see consistent patterns of considerable support for the original scenario, especially strong in Belfast, reasonably consistent across Paisley, Bridgend, and Reading. Slightly lower in Doncaster, and Doncaster here was an outlier in that support seemed to increase with the altered scenario, the second scenario. If we turn then to the question of sectoral and regional trade balances, we asked a question and got the participants to deliberate on an issue around a trade deal that prioritizes business service sector workers over agricultural workers. And we see here that there was much more skepticism about a deal that prioritized business sector workers over agricultural workers, particularly in the original scenario. The altered scenario in this case asked whether the view would change if new jobs were created primarily outside the southeast of England, and that shifted quite considerably from original skepticism to more support. If we look at this pattern across locations, again, you see a fairly consistent pattern across the locations with considerably more support for the second altered scenario, and quite a lot of decline in opposition. There was an increase in don't knows in some of the places, particularly Reading, and perhaps the most dramatic increase in support for the scenario in Doncaster. And there we have, between Reading and Doncaster, we have a contrast between the only location within, broadly speaking, the southeast of England and a northern town in England, where the emphasis on jobs outside of the southeast appeared particularly strong. And that's where I will draw my remarks to a close. Thanks very much. I think you're still on mute, Alan.
Sorry. How many times? So thank you very much indeed, Dan. And thanks for being concise as well. I think to keep the flow going, I'll move straight on to Maria Savona, who will talk about the other set of substantive results. And then I'll come back to Kieran Cummings to tell us, reveal how we got it all. So Maria is a professor of economics and innovation in the Science Policy Research Unit in the University of Sussex. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Alan. Can you hear me okay while I share my screen?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. And you can also see, I guess, right? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll pick up from Dan. So what I will tell you is the what happens in other two cases of trade-off policies, namely a trade-off in policy related to digital trade, which I myself with Javier Ruiz conducted, and another case related to food standards conducted by Vivian Gravy as well. So let me summarize briefly. So very briefly, what Kieran was about to explain, I think it was that the process illustrated. So we, CITP team, explained a little bit the background of these trade-offs, and then NatCen produced a final workshop whether when citizens were supposed to discuss and vote on different motions that related to this specific trade-off. So let me start with digital trade. So what Javier and I explained in terms of pros and cons of liberalizing or facilitating digital trade. So ideally, if the UK government produce something that supports digital trade, this means that cross-border data flows are allowed more easily, which means trading in digital services. And this in theory would allow consumers and business to access innovative and cheaper global services than what can be offered locally. So it means globalizing digital trade, which is intrinsically global. Ideally, this would also support business to more innovation and ideally creating more jobs and so on. So these are usually the pros related to digital trade that are intrinsic to facilitating trade in general. However, because we're talking about data transfers, this might raise issues that, especially when personal data are traded or transferred or shared, these increase risks for consumers, for example, data rights like privacy, and also can stop regulators from making companies accountable. And one of the cases we conducted in this report relates to sharing health data, which is a very peculiar case, but it would illustrate at the extreme what are the trade-offs related to facilitating access to facilitating process that share health data with companies outside the UK, namely for the reason that I'll explain in a second. However, the cons of this might be having to do with countries that have lower levels of protection when it comes to data rights. Also, for example, restricting access to software can stop scrutiny of problems that are related to digital services. So ideally, the cons of digital trade can be summarized in exposing the UK to countries with lower standard protection. That's the idea. So one of the main trade-off around digital trade that was discussed in the process were related to health data specifically. We framed the question in this context as illustrated here. So ideally, do the benefits of accessing cheaper or better global digital health services, or for example, sharing health data that would help developing cutting-edge medical treatment, would outweigh the cost of actually being exposed to lower standard regulation of technology that might, for example, in the realm of health data, raise privacy or other data rights abuse. And that's how the when framed or when asked these questions, the citizen jury tend to vote yes to the question, should the UK make it easier for the NHS, for instance, to share data and work closely with health data companies outside the UK that might have lower standards? And the public voted yes, even more when the benefits, for example, to access digital treatment that were for rare disease, for example, or increase the frontier of health research, was valued more than the risks, apparently. And this is what happened in the digital trade case. A second case was related to a trade deal that would be in the context of agri-food and pesticides. So once again, it's about standards, and participants in the face-to-face session, after being given a very rich background on food and the environment and trade related to this context, they were invited to vote on hypothetical scenarios where the UK was, agreeing a trade deal with Australia, where the government predicted that a decrease in prices of imported foods when the trade agreement was conducted, and the benefit would also be a greater variety of food products for consumers. But however, the cons would be ideally being potentially, again, exposed to imported food with lower pesticide standards. That was the case that citizens were supposed to discuss. Once again, to summarize, the pros are cheaper products or higher quality, or substance maybe not approved in the UK, might be because they're based on crops not grown in the UK, but safe in other places. However, the cons would be detrimental effect, for example, on local farmers or in general on the environment and health. And this was the case framed with respect to this. So when asked, should the UK facilitate food import, lower price and greater quality, even if it risks undermining UK pesticide standards, people tend to vote no, even when posted, when asked a scenario after bringing devolution in, they basically they rejected the motion by voting no, and that's the results of the actual procedure, the actual scenarios, the actual jury. So when a final one, and I'm picking up from what Dan was mentioning earlier, the report also shows, shares what were the main criteria that people valued that underpin decisions. And also they were asked to share what kind of trust, so where their trust would go in terms of expertise. Once again, the main criteria underpinning this decision was fairness. So ideally, people voted in favor of sharing benefits across groups and territories, benefits of the deals. The UK national interest was a great criteria, but also local interest. So ideally, the decisions were moving in terms of benefits of growth, and they were territory specific. And Dan also showed this. And also that long-term impact or sustainability of the trade deal would be important for them. Finally, and I could see Alan, and I'm closing now, interestingly, I think that citizens or people chose to trust people that define experts on the ground, which means people that had real-world experience to deal with real impact of trade policy, which is an interesting point with respect to the fact that people were also trusting independent specialists, for example, public research or academics, when ideally the trade-off would need a proper assessment and an independent assessment of risks and benefits, which I think is interesting in this context. I think I'll stop here and get back to Alan, and thanks for this.
Thank you again, Maria, and thanks again for being nice and timely on this. I'm going to go back to Kieran now, who's going to explain some of the magic behind getting to these results. But just remind people, we are open to questions. We're particularly interested to know what you would make out of all of this. And one of the purposes of doing this exercise was to ask whether it threw up the need for research that we hadn't really planned originally. We have got a bit of resource set aside to do research arising out of this sort of consultation process. So please don't hold back with questions later. But now over to Kieran. Back again, Kieran.
So apologies, everyone. You can never be sure with technology, can you? So I'll take off from where I understand I got to. So as I say, NatCen does a range of social research, but I am from its Centre for Deliberative Research. Deliberative research is at base about these three phases. So providing people with information that they need to learn about specific, often quite complex policy topics, giving them the time and the space and the good discursive conditions to deliberate on that, and then supporting them to kind of end in the process of really coming to a firm decision on these policy topics. So it might be recommendations, or it might be reaching a consensus. And to support them to do that, we have trained facilitators on hand. I was one of the facilitators throughout this process, and we had a good number of them, given the number of participants, to really support people to go through that. And it's really necessary because we are trying to yield insights about people's really considered views. These are complex topics. They might have real contentious bases that are about people's different worldviews, different values, and they require trade-offs, as you just heard from the different presentations, that can be quite difficult, but they are necessary to resolve, just as we have in the real situation when we're deciding on policy. So who took part in this? Our achieved sample had 113 participants from across the 5 locations you can see on your screen there. They were recruited via a trusted recruitment partner that we use through NatCen, and people were remunerated for their time and supported to participate. So whether that's technological support with their travel to the final session, which was in person. And it's really important, we feel, to do that and all that remuneration and support, because it is a big investment. It's a few hours a week over a number of weeks, weekday evenings, and then a kind of full afternoon, almost a full day of final deliberation. And these participants were broadly reflective of both the national and local population. So with the numbers, it's about 20 to 25 from each of these locations. What we try to do, what we tend to try and do in these processes, if it takes this more localized approach, is have some mind towards the kind of national representative proportions, but also think about what's this locality and what's specific to here demographically. And in particular for this research, given the focus on trade and the way trade decisions impact on work and people's working lives and jobs, we also took note of kind of local industries, key job sectors, and how they factor in to the samples from different locations. So this process, this form of deliberative research, it's called a citizens' jury. And what that essentially means is members of the public, they consider evidence on a given policy issue, so in this case trade, in order to reach decisions or recommendations, or more generally just to get a feel for the spread of opinion. These are often controversial, contentious issues, as I alluded a moment ago. But this process, because of that time and the space and the information, participants do often reach more kind of common goals. They won't always, but they might reach consensus. And they are often quite outward-looking, societally concerned positions that people reach. As you can guess by the name, it's modelled on a sort of criminal jury. So the jurors or the participants here are presented with a balance of evidence to inform their decision, really key thing there. And these juries tend to take place over a number of meetings, as I've mentioned. And in this case, people met over 3 weeks, 4 sessions online, and then a final 5th session in person in their particular locality. So they were deliberating right at the end with some of the same people that they were talking to over the previous weeks. And having it disaggregated in that way means that really benefited the analysis, and will continue to, we hope, with what CITP does with the data still, to be able to compare and contrast in that fashion. So just to give you a bit more detail on that process, I won't go through in tremendous amounts because you've heard some of the kind of topics there. But as you can see, people were week by week getting an overview of the different positions and views and core information needed to reflect on these different trade policy areas. And then this culminated in this final deliberative phase of an in-person session in their different locations. And throughout all of that, as is noted at the bottom, the kind of information that was being shared was available to participants. And this included kind of if they'd raised questions, if they had queries, they wanted more information on a certain topic, or didn't quite understand something, they could access answers to those questions in between sessions, and also were kind of refreshed on some of those answers during the sessions as well. So really, it's about what goes on between the sessions too, that kind of gestating and the way that the information will continue to be reflected on by participants. And as you heard in that final, people were presented with particular trade-offs, but what we did in the final session is really try to bring this to life for people. So prior to the final session, they were there as themselves. And what we tried to do in the last deliberations was get people in the mindset of a policymaker. So we'd say to you, you know, you're here, you're a member of parliament, you are faced with these trade decisions, and these would still be hypothetical, of course, but we tried to give it as much of that sheen, so presenting information as if they're being briefed as an MP, and they'd have this kind of level of detail. And then we pose it to them as if it were, you know, a particular clause of a deal or a particular deal overall that they were trying to consider and to weigh in on as a member of parliament. And as a member of parliament, therefore, they've got to think about, you know, their constituents, different interests, different lobby groups that would be speaking to them, their party, all this sorts of things, the national interest. So really weighing things up from many directions. So the key takeaways, I'd say, are, and we detail this in the conclusion of the report, it did identify emerging themes in people's reasoning, as was noted by Maria there. And we think definitely further analysis of the transcripts will reveal a lot more about that. And that's a real benefit of deliberative processes. You don't just get an insight on what people's views are at the end, but you get an idea of how they reach those views. And finally, I'd just say, you know, these processes, they show that if you give people these opportunities, you give members of the public, they can grapple with these complex decisions and come out with really interesting results. And deliberation is a useful way for trade researchers to work with the public in that way. And we think it will help lay the groundwork for the CIT's mission to create a more inclusive conversation about trade. So we're really interested to see what the CITP do next with the data, because there's so many more rich insights that can be gleaned, we think. So I'll pass over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Kieran. So let me say these are preliminary results because they're based on the voting that we had during the sessions, on notes from the facilitators. But what we haven't looked at yet are transcripts of their discussions. We have those at hand now, and the CITP will be analysing them in a good deal more detail over the summer, over the rest of the year. So let me say thank you to the speakers. In the absence of any questions from any of the audience, but let me urge you to put that right. Yeah, perhaps I can pose a question. First of all, perhaps to Kieran, would you like to say a little bit about why we think these are sort of genuine reflections of people's views, rather than their views about what they ought to be saying when somebody asks them a question about sort of trading off this interest against that interest?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's always a worry, right, with, you know, the kind of social desirability that can play out here, and just the huge number of kind of the dynamics that can be at play if people feel under pressure in these conversations and discussions to have a view. I think the most reassuring, the thing that most reassures about that is just the extent of this. So, you know, whereas, yeah, if it was kind of a one-off question they were posed through a poll or a focus group, this is much more extensive. People are meeting over multiple weeks. If they have any kind of sense that they might be inclined to do that, there's a chance that's going to dissipate. And definitely by the end, when you have those in-person deliberations, people have a lot more familiarity with what they're doing, and it's very, very few participants who by that point haven't really kind of changed their views in some ways, or reflected in some ways, and altered where they are, and really become invested in the process. And so the answers they're giving, they're often a lot more kind of they really want to show that this is considered. Their priority at that point is to show this is what I think as a member of the public the right decision here would be, more than anything else.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps let me ask Maria and Dan if they'd like to respond to a question from Arabella. She says she's very interested in whom it is that people will trust to take decisions on trade policy. And did we explore the extent to which they wanted MPs to understand and decide on trade deals? And is that something, if we don't have a firm answer about that we would like to do? So in a sense, it's a question, I think, about their faith in MPs internalising sort of issues that we face them with, in order to take better informed decisions. Dan, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to give that a go. I mean, I think there was a clear sense that participants thought that Parliament was an appropriate forum for considering these sorts of issues, and that was pretty consistent across the different locations for the citizens' juries. In Scotland, there was also, I think, some sense of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish government being an appropriate forum. Very little trust in local politicians in Belfast. What was particularly interesting to us, though, I think, was a sense that participants really worked through the complexity of trade policy and trade policy choices and dilemmas. And in that context, I think there was a really striking emphasis on experts and this distinction that Maria drew attention to in her presentation between, as it were, on the ground experts and more detached experts, and the participants seemed keen to have both kinds of expertise engaged. I don't know if Maria wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, the way we interpret, as Alan mentioned, we're going to explore much more in depth all the notes and of the transcriptions and so on. So that's something that we can actually, Arabella, go much more in depth. I mean, what seemed to be emerging is that people were actually, they were sacrificing a little bit of independence because they were trusting expertise when it was about looking at what the actual risks, so having an overall scenario, what the risks related to the trade-off were about. In that case, they would actually trust independence and expertise much more than hands-on people. And actually, they were trusting more what they called real-world expertise when it comes to assessing the actual impact of the trade-off. So there seemed to be this sort of dichotomy in what people valued the most when it came to trusting expertise. That's the way we interpret it. But as I said, that's something that we're going to dig much more in depth when we look at the actual transcriptions.
Okay, thanks very much.
I hope it satisfies.
Thank you, Maria. I was also involved in this research, so I'm going to abuse my position as chair to add one thing. We did do brief surveys before and after the whole process, so before anything started, right after everything had finished. And one of the questions was, whom would you trust? We didn't notice that much difference from the pre and the post surveys, but we did observe that in the question about whom would people trust, the confidence or the desire to trust MPs in Westminster and devolved administrations increased. And people expressed rather less faith, it declined between the surveys, in civil society and trade unions. We don't know, we haven't listened, we haven't worked on the transcripts yet, but my interpretation of that was that people actually recognized the complexity of these issues and felt that decisions had to go back to somewhere where there was at least a sporting chance that every side would be considered, rather than, as it were, trusting these decisions to people who had a very, very committed position on them. And that is certainly something which I think we can explore.
If I can,
sorry.
If I could just to qualify something on there as well. So I think a really important thing to note about trust, that so absolutely from the survey data we saw that an element that came through from what we could glean from the qualitative data is that I definitely think at play was partly what you're talking about, in sort of a sense of we want it to go back to this institution. We know that we might get kind of fair hearing there, but I think what comes with that was essentially participants that they were coming to understand, this is how things currently are. It is in the hands of the politicians. And so there was a sense of, well, this is where the power lies. So I think what will be really interesting to see when you can look closer at the transcript data in that way is some of that nuance of how much of this is a support for that institution and how much of it is a sense of, well, we're here, that it's in the hands of politicians, and how much is it going to change?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. So there's lots more work for us. And so thank you, Arabella. I have also a question here from Gethin Rees, who was very interested in the way that things changed when we moved from, as it were, suggesting that food standards would be managed by Australian exporters, essentially using Australian standards, as opposed to using standards of England and Wales, and sort of imposing them, or as it were, requiring that to be the norm for Scotland and Ireland. And Gething asks, were the results in the devolved nations juries different? And we do have a little bit of evidence on, we do have evidence on that. If I think, Maria, if you've got that slide up, you might be able to put it up, I think, because you can sort of report what's there. And was it a question of the English outnumbering people from the other nations in this series? It certainly wasn't that. All the juries were the same size, and we've always kept the results for Reading and Doncaster separate. So in the aggregate, yes, you're seeing twice as many English have on average than from each of the other nations, but in the individual 5 individual juries, they were all roughly the same size. So Maria, I don't know if you want to try and shed a little bit of light. I think you had, did you have the regional?
Well, thanks, Gethin. That's an interesting question. I think I'm gonna just add a little bit of what Alan said. Also, considering that was the case illustrated by Vivian, I actually didn't show the results on the devolved nations, but only the overall. But I think what you probably mean is that what I showed you was the actual the overall, so the results related to the whole UK. I guess what would make the difference, I guess this is in the report, so you can have a look at that online, is what were the territories or the territories that the world government that were more specialized in those sectors that would be more exposed to lower standards when it comes to food import with lower standards on pesticides. So ideally, for example, Wales or and so on. So there's more detail in the final report. In terms of numbers, as Alan said, I mean, all the sample were equal size. So I don't think that's a result of this. Maybe you mean the specialization agriculture of different regions, and in that case, I hope the response satisfies. I hope it makes sense. Thanks, Gethin.
Yeah, okay. Vivian, who actually ran those sessions, said she would be happy to respond, but I don't think we have the technology to sort of bring her on. Oh, we do. So here she is. Vivian, do you want to say briefly?
Okay. I was just typing it in. So the second, the devolution variation was about Scotland and Northern Ireland having different standards from England and Wales. And in this hypothetical scenario, the Scottish and Northern Irish standards were higher, the English and Welsh standards were lower, and the import from our hypothetical Australia would match the English-Welsh standard, not the Scottish Northern Irish higher standards. And what we found is that participants, well, first, I mean, in the discussions, participants were like, why would we have different standards? Which does raise interesting questions for devolution. But they were also much more willing in that scenario to accept the Australian import, because they said, well, the English and Welsh standards surely are good enough. So again, that's very early days for us, but looking at the detail of how this worked out, but that's what was happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivian. In fact, I think I remember that the biggest change between sort of the original and the altered scenario, in which what Vivian said is correct, that the English and Wales standards applied in both Scotland and Northern Ireland. The biggest change that induced actually was in Doncaster. And this is a very sort of complicated little story, which it may be with a bit more statistical analysis we might get inside, but these are small samples, so we can't really do much statistical analysis. Thank you very much. So let me move on. A question from Heather, following up from Arabella. Did people feel they should be more engaged in discussing trade policy? Would they like more consultation? Kieran, I don't know if you remember something of this.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think there was definitely, I think there's two things to say. So one is, if you from the as the process went on, one of the things that we could gather already was just kind of, and for ourselves, the people who run these celebrations all the time, what was so interesting is this is a topic so many people are unfamiliar with. It's often the case that we run these, you'll see lots of them on climate change, for example, and different kind of policy responses there, but it's something that we have a bit more familiarity with. Trade is a kind of topic which plays a slightly more abstract role in many people's lives. And so early on, it wasn't the case that people were averse to the idea of kind of further consultation or even learning more. People wanted to stick around, thankfully. But there was just a lot of kind of getting to grips, understanding how does trade work, and what would it mean to be consulted on it. Definitely by the end, there was a huge amount of, and this bears out in the findings themselves. You can see more of this in the report, but kind of more anecdotally, just the way people will be talking by the final deliberations. There was a real sense of this topic, which has a huge impact on my life, whether it's the food I buy, the jobs that I can, that are available to me and my family and so on. It was made very concrete to people how trade policy decisions affect their lives. And it was also made concrete to them how they don't necessarily have many avenues to consult, be consulted on or have this kind of input. So I definitely think there was a sense by the end people, would like to be engaged more on this and were really interested by that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Kira. Dan, can I turn to you and sort of enlarge it a little bit in a sense? Not only should people, the general public be involved, but, about attitudes towards sort of decision taking in general. Who gets consulted?
Thanks, Alan. Following on from what Kieran said, I think Kieran's illustrated the kind of richness and complexity of this sort of issue and how challenging it is for people to kind of work through the choices and dilemmas involved, but also that there's a real appetite to do so. If you go back to the pre and post surveys, it's clear that at the beginning there was a sort of in principle interest in the UK government, taking into account the views of the public, and that level was pretty much sustained in the post survey, the post deliberation survey. So here I think the critical thing is that sort of getting under the hood of the deliberative process to understand how a sustained high level of interest in having their views being taken into account is underpinned by a much richer and more complex understanding of what's going on there. I mean, I would say also that I think this is one of the reasons why trying to get a grip on public attitudes, what citizens, what people think about trade policy really needs this sort of deliberative research. If you'd gone out with a sort of standard public attitude survey and asked people questions about trade policy, I think it would take real skill to come up with questions that could tap into a real sense of what people think about trade policy in a simple survey question. So really getting into the deliberative process, I think, is an important part of what's going on here. In a sense, then, just to wrap up on this point, and picking up on the earlier question about taking into account devolved views and the views of MPs and so on, and how in both of those categories, a larger proportion of people thought those views should be taken account at the end of the process than at the beginning. I think it is also noteworthy, though, that although fewer people thought that unions and civil society organizations should be taken into account at the end, for business leaders, the level of support remained pretty high at the 2 points and was pretty much as high as taking into account the views of the public. So there's quite a lot of complexity in here, with sustained levels of support for government taking into account business leaders and public views, increased emphasis on devolved authorities and MPs, and a bit of tailing away for civil society organizations and unions. But we're going to need to do much more research really to get a sense of how those balances play out in more detail.
Thanks very much, Dan. I've got one last question, but we've only got a few minutes left, so that's probably fine. Miniko asked, what was the age distribution of the participants? And I don't have that to hand, but we did try to make each sample representative of its local area, and it was calibrated against age, and we had objectives in each of the sectors. I don't know if you can remember the numbers, Kieran, but what I think we also say is we didn't, I think, ever intend to analyze the results by generation. And the only thing that we could possibly do is possibly, if we can identify them, go back to the surveys. But even there, we don't have any access to who answered which question, which way.
Yeah. No, I mean, not much to add to that. I think that's spot on. Just say there was, so as I was saying on my slide, throughout all of this, and it's particularly given the size of a citizens jury, you are seeing about 20 to 25 people. There's always lots of trade-offs in how you're representing, what you're trying to represent. With age, we generally had quite a good balance across age bands in different locations. Paisley, we had slightly fewer younger participants, I think it was, but overall we had quite a good, quite an even distribution. Bearing in mind, as Alan said, some of the occasions where we try to reflect the locality slightly more.
Okay, thanks very much. Perhaps the last couple of minutes, I can turn to Maria and Dan in particular and say, what do you take away from this process? Sort of next steps. What are you going to do in the next 6 months? It's going to resolve all this stuff, these data. That's a question from the director. Maria.
Thanks, Alan. What I'm looking forward to is actually delving much more in depth into the actual process, because the value of this exercise, which I think is tremendous, is actually how people deliberate that. So what is the nuances and sort of shifts in the debate that people were more sensitive to. And I think this is only possible when we're going to look at the actual transcripts of the debate and so on. I think there's a tremendous value beyond the numbers on votes people actually decide what are the criteria and the thinkings. For example, what I will like to dwell a bit more in depth into this question of trust, which I think in the debates nowadays, particularly when it comes to the case that I looked at, the sharing of health data, which I think is actually quite important at the moment and has been important quite recently, for example, when during the pandemics and the vaccines, has a tremendous impact on how people actually decide around these huge trade-offs. And I think we have a tremendous responsibility on how to frame these questions properly, so that people can be properly informed and decide. So that's what the two axes I'm going to look at.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I'd say a couple of things. I think the first thing I'd say is that I very much recommend that the people attending this webinar download and read the report, the NatCen report, and also our briefing paper, but particularly the NatCen report. I think one of the tremendously valuable things about this form of research is capturing the language and the terms in which participants grapple with the kinds of difficult policy dilemmas that we confront in relation to trade policy and the trade-offs involved. There's a real richness, and the report does a lovely job of capturing some of those quotes, some of the language in which people try and work through these problems. The second thing is really to echo what Maria said about the underlying richness here in the transcripts. I think it'll give us a rich sense of the of both the views, but also the process of deliberation on these sorts of issues. And for me, I'm confident it'll generate valuable research findings and publications in its own right. But I think it also serves a kind of generative role for the centre more generally. This is the first piece of substantive social research that's been conducted for CITP, and I think it'll inform a really wide range of activities that we take on in the future, particularly placing the accent on the second initial in the name of the centre, the inclusiveness. I think it'll help us to frame what are some very complex and technical, economic, legal, social analyses, but to inform them with citizens' attitudes at the start seems to me to be absolutely critical.
So thank you very much indeed, Dan. I think all three of us on the screen, also Vivian, who was involved, would like finally to thank Kieran and NatCen for doing all the technical work. And, it's very complicated. We learned a lot from this process. We've enjoyed it very much. So thank you very much. We've expired our time now, and so we sign off. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you at the next CITP webinar. Bye-bye.